Good morning, and thank you all very much for joining us this morning. My name is Steve McManaman, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which is part of the continuing series of the Greenwich Roundtable. Our topic this morning, ESG investing, path to prosperity, or philanthropic confusion, is our first look at a subject we've resisted for way too long. Our mission here is the discovery of opportunity sets and inefficient pricing. And for years, I've asked our committee chairs, how are we going to make money off this subject? So as we move into, value creation as opposed to profit making, we're not so much obsessed with profits as we are with value creation, and hence today's subject. And we've got three important intellectuals to enlighten us today. At this point, I'll briefly introduce them after I say this. The speakers' views are their own and don't necessarily reflect our views. So having gotten that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speakers alphabetically. Barbara Novick is the vice chairman of BlackRock, an old friend of the Roundtable, and probably one of the most important people in the global markets today. She was one of the early founders of BlackRock, and today she oversees the firm's public policy and investment stewardship activities around the world. Before BlackRock, Ms. Novick led First Boston's mortgage portfolio products team. Barbara's a trustee of Cornell University, a member of the executive committee of the Investment Company Institute, a member of the UJA Federation's Finance Committee, and a coach in the Westchester Youth Soccer League. Sitting next to Barbara is Robert Sitkoff, is the John Gray Professor of Harvard Law School, where he was the youngest professor with tenure to receive a chair in the history of the school. Professor Sitkoff is an expert in wills, trust, estates, and fiduciary administration, and his research focuses on economic and empirical analysis of trusts, estates, and fiduciary administration. Rob is an active participant in trust and estates law reform. He serves under the Massachusetts gubernatorial appointment on the Uniform Law Commission, and he edits the Wills, Trust, and Estates Abstracting Journal in the Social Science Research Network. Sitting next to Rob, Robert Posen is senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's a former president of Fidelity and executive chairman of MFS. Before that, Bob served as associate general counsel of the SEC in the late 1970s and chairman of the SEC's Advisory Committee on Financial Reporting in 2007 and 2008. He was a member of the President's Commission to Strengthen Social Security and served as the Secretary of Economic Affairs under Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. Bob's an outside trustee of Medtronic, Nielsen, and AMC, and he sits on the governing board of several not-for-profit institutions. And the moderator of the Greenwich Roundtable today is Bob Dannhauser. Bob is the head of the Global Capital Markets Policy at the CFA Institute in New York City. Bob manages a team of policy analysts responsible for regulatory consultation and outreach in Washington and Brussels, as well as developing thought leadership content related to the integrity of the markets. Please welcome Bob as he sets the table.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I was really pleased to be able to join this particular topic and this particular group, of course. It's been 40 years ago since I started my career in the investment management business with the predecessor for what was one of the first socially responsible investment firms in the United States, the Calvert Group down in Washington, D.C. And back at that time in the late 70s, it was a simpler time. We identified bad stocks and good stocks, and we invited people to invest in our funds that avoided the bad stocks, that rooted them out and kept them out of portfolios. It was pretty much pure virtue signaling, and it invited people to align their values with ours. Those values typically tended to be more to the left than to the right. They were more easily assignable to a political orientation than an economic orientation. And in fact, we didn't really worry too much about impact on returns. It was a way of offering investors a way to sleep well at night, knowing that their profits were derived from things that they could be comfortable with, given their own orientations. Over the course of 40 years, things have changed a bit. The world has gotten a little bit more complicated. What we used to call socially responsible investing has now morphed into ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance factor investing, impact investing, sustainable investments. Rob, I think in one of your writings, you called it the rebranding as a way of winning more converts to this particular style of investing. And I think what we're going to explore today is just what is this? Because it could represent an interesting approach to investments. It could be a representation of the economic power that investors control and the ability to circumvent political channels to achieve social goals using economic might. Back in the 70s, the Sullivan Principles, Reverend Sullivan's approach to addressing the injustices of apartheid in South Africa using the economic might of investors was a very successful and impressive demonstration of the potential to use economic might to achieve political aims. It could be another form of risk management, and this isn't too far from the way we approach it at CFA Institute in our curriculum as a way of identifying characteristics, future risks, and the risks associated with the people who are in charge of managing businesses and executing and developing strategy to address those risks. It could be a source of return. The empirical evidence is mixed. Depending on who you talk to, you can find some fairly compelling cases that say that application of ESG factors or similar styles of investing definitely add value, definitely do not add value. On the whole, CFA Institute's perspective is that the weight of evidence does not support the case that ESG investing detracts from value. How it might contribute to value is still worthy of additional study, and we're certainly interested in being a part of that. And perhaps importantly to many of us in this room is what impact does all of this have on the stewards of investment assets? So how does this reflect on our responsibilities and our accountabilities, whether we're formally a fiduciary or a fiduciary in spirit, in how we approach the management of other people's money? So I think the panel is just right to explore all of those issues and tease out exactly where we are and perhaps more importantly, what the future is for ESG investing. We're going to start with Barbara, perhaps appropriately, given the stir that Larry Fink's letter to CEOs a year ago created, and perhaps even the greater stir that the fake letter yesterday created. And what was really interesting, I think, about the fake letter was that it didn't necessarily scream out that it was a fake, right? In a changed world where BlackRock, who is not one of the sort of tree huggers of past, where a company like BlackRock is speaking about these issues, it didn't seem all that incredible that the alleged issues that were described in the fake letter yesterday might credibly come from a place like BlackRock. So Barbara, start us off. How do you think about these issues?
Well, I'll start by taking a little exception that anybody who read that whole letter and really thought it was from us, wow. Okay. So good morning, and Steve, thank you for inviting me. As Bob indicated, there's obviously a much greater increased focus on ESG and related topics and a lot of controversy about it. I'm going to try and cover a number of subjects fairly quickly. Start with a little bit of a historical context, touch on the regulatory landscape, especially here in the U.S., spend most of my time on what we call value versus values, and also explain some of the data behind ESG investing. I'll touch on investment stewardship, because that is clearly a component of this, and finally end with the role that asset owners play, which doesn't get enough attention.
Is this an hour speech?
ESG and sustainable investing reflects a decades-long journey. This isn't something new. What began as a values discussion, and you just heard from Bob, it was very much a values discussion, has really evolved over time to a discussion about value. And the idea of whether it's governance or environmental or social issues driving investment value over time. So if you go back to April 2006, the original Principles for Responsible Investing, or the PRI, they were launched. There were 63 signatories with $6.5 trillion in assets. The goal was to commit to considering ESG in your investment analysis and then reporting on your progress. If you look today, the PRI has grown to 1,900 signatories, representing over 80 trillion in assets. According to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, approximately 26% of the assets under management globally are in some way incorporating ESG factors. That's broadly defined. Not surprisingly, both companies and asset owners are aligning their own businesses and their investments with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, sometimes called SDGs, if you haven't picked up the lingo. According to KPMG's survey of corporate responsibility reporting, 40% of the world's largest 250 companies discuss SDGs in their corporate reporting. So while we can all agree that interest is soaring, we can also agree that there's no agreement about even the most basic definitions of terms. So people use interchangeably ESG, sustainable investing, responsible investing, ethical investing, impact investing, and unless you have the context and actually know the speaker, hence the letter and reading of the letter, you really are not sure what they're talking about. So the increased interest has led to this public debate. We'll call it profit or purpose. Sometimes people call it Milton Friedman versus Larry Fink. But if you go back to the Milton Friedman quotes, I'm going to give you a few quotes today to put things in context. In 1962, he wrote, "There is one and only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage its activities designed to increase its profits." So that lays out one side. In what's become known as Larry's letter, which is an annual letter he does every year to CEOs around the world, it happens that this morning's letter will be posted in about 30 minutes, so I'll be done talking by then, Bob, but you might be in the middle. Last year, he wrote that to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. And he went on to talk about stakeholders, shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities. And we'll talk a little more about that. When it was written, and I was involved in that, we had no idea what kind of impact it was going to create. But if you think logically about the world we live in today versus the world in 1962, there are a few different pressures. A lot's changed. So we've seen the age of the internet, the mindset of millennials has really changed the environment for businesses. Yesterday's fake news, somebody literally spoofing our website and Larry's letter and trying to create news. That is unheard of in the past. In fact, yesterday my comment was, I thought we'd heard of everything, but this is really crazy. Okay, and if you're not convinced, think about things like the Me Too movement and how people think about sexual harassment today in the workplace. Or think about the 20,000 employees from Google who walked out in unison. If you think we're in the same world, we're not. And in a world where we have a war for talent, and certainly here in the US, unemployment is very low, if you treat all your employees like they're cogs in a wheel, is that going to lead to good retention? So you can read into these words anything you like, and people do. But when you think about stakeholders, I like to use examples and say, how should you treat your customers? Do you treat them well? Do they come back and buy more things? Do you treat them poorly? They're not your customers anymore. So it's not a lefty concept to say, running a good business, you should treat all your stakeholders very, very well. So hopefully, if there's one thing that you take away is today, it's not a binary choice. We would say profit and purpose, which happens to be the nickname of Larry's letter. Steve, your timing of this breakfast was excellent. And we would say that they are increasingly both symbiotic and aligned. So I said I was going to touch on the regulatory landscape. I'm going to point out the obvious, that if we were having this conversation in Europe, it's a little bit different than in the US. While Europe is actively debating, I say, how far to go, they've contemplating everything from mandatory reporting, requiring the inclusion of ESG in investment decisions, defining a taxonomy about what does it mean to be green, and so on. It's safe to say here in the US, people are a little bit less gung-ho. and when it comes especially to prescriptive rules. So let me give you a couple of data points. SEC Chairman Clayton raised a number of these issues recently at the SEC's Investment Advisory Committee, and his quote was, "A key responsibility of the SEC is to ensure that the mix of information companies provide to investors facilitates well-informed decision-making." Couldn't say that better. The concepts of materiality, comparability, flexibility, efficiency, and responsibility are the linchpins of our approach. He goes on to say that companies should focus on providing material disclosure that a reasonable investor needs to make an informed decision on investment or on voting. It's a very important concepts. Of course, the DOL weighed in earlier this year. They had a field assistance bulletin in April where they talked about not permitting managers to sacrifice investment return to promote collateral social policy goals. That certainly put a number of ESG proponents in a tizzy. But if you read their full bulletin, they went on to say that to the extent ESG factors involve business risks or opportunities that are properly treated as economic considerations, they could be considered. So you have to look at this in a lens that, again, people read into it what they want to in many cases, but there is room for ESG investing, even with the DOL. So are we talking about value or values? And since Rob is here, I'll say, or as Rob Sitkoff calls them, risk-return ESG or collateral benefits ESG. Values-based investing is a client-driven concept where the asset owner has a moral or ethical view, and you heard that. There's a lot of Bobs. Bob, and Rob. Okay, so makes it really easy. Okay.
3 Roberts and a Barbara.
Okay, so it's a client-driven concept where you've got this moral or ethical view on an industry that doesn't align with values. Those clients choose to either exclude or explicitly include investments that line up with their values. And the approach can change the investable universe in a way that maybe creates tracking error, very likely does, but it's a risk that the investors understand and they accept. And even today, a large swath of ESG style investing is in exactly these kinds of approaches. What we're talking about today, though, is value-based investing. It's a very different concept. Here, the investor accepts that insights into the material, environmental, social, and governance issues can help be drivers of return, both positive and negative. So we'll talk about risks and opportunities. It's an investment thesis. It's not a moral or an ethical perspective on an industry or on a company. It's very much investment driven. But the lack of agreement on definitions is part of the challenge. There's a woman, Yafit Cohen, who testified on behalf of travelers at the same hearing where Chairman Clayton spoke. And all of these remarks, their full remarks, are available online. Yafit expressed the definitional problems, saying ESG has been conflated with impact investing and with corporate social responsibility. And she actually spent a year trying to figure out for travelers as a reporting entity what they should be doing. And she talks about ESG at its core, referring to the risks and opportunities that could impact a company's ability to create value over the long term. We totally agree with her assessment. So while ESG may have begun years ago as a values-based strategy, and certainly many asset owners continue down that path, a growing number of institutional investors and many of our clients are actually embracing ESG, taking more of a value-based approach. And at BlackRock, we now call this sustainable investing. A key question then is, what data should investors consider? And of course, is the data available? If you went back 10 years, the answer would be unequivocally no. In fact, limited data was available, and the data that wasn't of very good quality. But a decade's a long time, and this is an evolving field, and we're seeing a lot of progress. Yafit points out that the ecosystem for for-profit and non-for-profit ESG-related entities is exploding. Now, this is both a positive and a negative, as we'll explain. She tallied up travelers received 55 surveys and data verification requests from ESG rating organizations in 1 year. We recently created a spreadsheet to track 75 known providers of ESG data. The organizations' names you've heard: MSCI, Sustainalytics, ISS, Morningstar, Just Capital, Ceres, Carbon Disclosure Project. That's just a few. It's no wonder that companies are starting to report survey fatigue. So while consistent high-quality data is very important, the proliferation of data providers creates what we consider an expensive and wasteful situation where companies have to decide how much assets or resources to devote to this. And the fact-checking is a really important component because very often the facts are wrong, and then those are the facts that are then used to determine a rating. Unfortunately, there's a lot more work being done to answer all these surveys and data requests, but they don't necessarily translate directly into better information for investors. And in fact, some of the different scoring systems create a lot of confusion. So for example, Yafit cited the ratings for travelers. Sustainalytics gave them a 28.7 score. Robeco Sam scored them at 58%. And the Carbon Disclosure Project gave them an A-. What does all that mean? Clearly, absent clearer standards, consistent reporting does not happen, and it's not serving either the issuers who are doing the reporting or the investors particularly well. So go back to Chairman Clayton. He said, each company and each sector has its own circumstances, which may or may not fit a standard framework. This is a really important insight. I almost want to go back and say it again, each company and each sector, because it highlights the challenge for companies and investors alike. Two of the frameworks that we find most useful, the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. It's a flexible framework for disclosure. It was designed for climate reporting, but in fact it could be applied to other E and S factors. And SASB has taken a very industry-specific approach with a lot of involvement from people from those industries with a specific focus on material issues. Not, I have a favorite cause, but what's material to the company. We would say the time has come for standard setters to come together, and if they don't, investors are going to need to coalesce around some set of standards and reduce the amount of noise. We agree that the data is far from perfect, but it certainly is improving. We break it into three main categories. There's company disclosure. As I mentioned earlier, more and more companies are talking about SDGs and other things, either regulatory reasons, social pressure, or just a belief that this is material information and something they should put out there. There are the ESG data providers. They come with their positives and negatives. We think it's important not just to take their headline numbers, but to look beyond the headlines, understand their methodology, and try and glean some information from that. And then there are big data approaches, and these are all new. So you can take data, and I'll give an example. Glassdoor has online information, ratings by employees about their employers. So if you think human capital management is important and you want to get employee sentiment, there's a source that you can look at. Now, you might say it's a biased source, it's self-selected, but in fact, it's got some pretty interesting data that you can use. So you also have to keep in mind that the relevant data is going to change over time. Again, examples are worth thousands of words. If you think back, one of the S factors today for MSCI is cybersecurity and data privacy. And in fact, they called out Equifax for this in 2016. They downgraded them to CCC. That was before their breach was reported. So the bottom line is we believe that the governance, environmental, and social factors, and I put them in that order for a reason, governance being number one, they're important to the long-term financial performance of companies. We find ourselves more in sync with Yasif as we think about these as both risks and opportunities. And we're committed to identifying data that we think is material to the companies and then incorporating that into our process. We define ESG integration as a practice of incorporating financially material ESG information. And clearly, it is not a values-based exercise for us. So investment stewardship. Larry's letter also highlighted the importance of investment stewardship, especially in index portfolios that are the providers of long-term stable capital to thousands of companies. As with ESG integration, it's not about making social decisions with our clients' money, it's not about imposing any particular values. Rather, investment stewardship is about maximizing long-term value. Our engagement emphasizes issues that we think are material to the companies. We prefer to what we call engagement first, to build a dialogue with a company rather than surprise them with a negative vote. Some people don't like that, hence the fake letter yesterday. We also believe that engagement leads to more informed voting than simply following the recommendations of proxy advisors. So this is one of the controversial issues that's out there right now. I would actually say, and I know someone introduced themselves earlier from Vanguard, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, we all have dedicated investment stewardship teams, and I can show you definitively we are not following ISS. Our voting patterns are very different. That's a good thing. You want multiple perspectives out there. So we know it's easy to measure voting and compare across managers, and that seems to be one of the new favorite sports. However, we do caution that voting is only one aspect of stewardship. Along with Larry's letter being posted at 9 o'clock, you'll see there's a new website for BlackRock's investment stewardship. We're very committed to transparency. We have improved the navigability of our website. We put an awful lot of information out there, our engagement priorities, our examples of engagement in our quarterly and annual reports, our actual voting records, commentaries. There's a wealth of information, which I know researchers love to go and look for. So I've given you exactly where to look. Our approach is very much aligned with Chairman Clayton's stated view. Asset managers who are required to vote in the best interest of their clients should also focus on each company's particular facts and circumstances. Advisors cannot put their own interests ahead of the interests of their clients, even on ESG matters. So let me end with, as I said, I think the asset owner is often left out of this discussion, but it would be incomplete. Asset managers are acting as fiduciaries on behalf of asset owners. Some of you are in this room are our clients. You're the asset owners. The client motivations in the ESG space fall today into what we call two categories: avoid and advance. As mentioned earlier, you can think of avoid as the exclusionary screens: tobacco, fossil fuels, defense. Put any X in that spot. And they reflect the social values of those clients, and we respect that. Advance, on the other hand, is a broader and more nuanced. We identify three subcategories within advanced. One is ESG portfolios that are optimized around ESG ratings, and they produce a broad portfolio with better than average ESG scores. We worked with MSCI to develop a series called the MSCI Focus Series, which has a higher tracking error, a tighter tracking error to the mother index than their original series, which is called the MSCI Leader Series. So we really find that this is a good way of getting something with, I'll call it an ESG tilt to it, yet still having market returns. Second group is thematic portfolios, which are designed for a specific positive environment. Things like solar power, wind power. We do a tremendous amount in that area. Dedicated portfolios for advancing a particular aspect, and we have a lot of clients interested in that. And third is what we call impact investing, which are portfolios that are targeting a specific sustainable outcome alongside financial return. So one of the areas that's become very popular is green bonds, and they direct money towards environmentally friendly projects, but still with a traditional fixed income characteristics. So, Steve, I want to thank you for organizing the event. Co-panelists, looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and it should be a pretty lively discussion.
Barbara, thank you. Rob, you've heard a lot from Barbara that's covered a broad swath of the issues at hand, including some of the regulatory issues. So in Europe, the regulatory debate around ESG has in part focused on responsibilities of asset managers specifically and how affirmative their responsibility is to include ESG factors as part of their decision making. In the U.S., the debate over the years has been characterized by advocates who say that a lot of these considerations have absolutely no role in fiduciary decision making, along with others who are a little bit closer to what's being advocated more broadly in Europe to absolutely include them as part of a manager's responsibilities. Your writing has touched upon a lot of the fiduciary aspects, both from the asset owner's perspective and other agents, including asset managers. How do you see these issues?
Okay, thanks. So thank you all for coming, listening, and Steve, thank you for the invite. What I'm going to focus on is just suggested is a fiduciary perspective, and that's right, the F word. Let me clarify what I mean by the F word, the fiduciary perspective. I want to say a little bit about not whether BlackRock can use ESG factors in its funds, but rather whether a fiduciary investor, by which I mean a pension fund, a trustee of a personal trust, a charitable endowment, whether it could choose to use a BlackRock fund because the fund uses ESG factors, or whether it could directly incorporate ESG factors in its own analysis. So what I'm speaking of now is the consistency of ESG investing with fiduciary status. I should also, by way of introductory disclosure, say that I got into this project along with my friend and colleague at Northwestern, Max Schatzenbach. Federated investors approached us to look at that question and to produce a white paper. So we took that engagement on, and it struck us that we needed to keep going and do a whole scholarly project on this. And so that is the origin, and now the base of what I'm talking about is the scholarly paper that Max and I put together. Okay, so to look at this question from a fiduciary perspective, and I want to suggest from almost any perspective, I think we need to have a clearer sense of what we mean when we say ESG investing. I think Barbara's remarks really touched on this, all the different synonymous terms: ESG investing, sustainable investing, impact investing, economically targeted investing, socially responsible investing. What has happened is all of these various concepts have merged together under the umbrella term ESG. And that's caused a lot of confusion. So what we try to do in this paper, and what I want to suggest is critical from a fiduciary perspective, is to differentiate what we call collateral benefits ESG investing from what, as Barbara previewed, we call risk-return ESG investing. So let me say a word about what I mean by these different categories and then how that plays out for fiduciary. So by collateral benefits ESG investing, I'm talking about using these factors to guide your investment program because for moral or ethical reasons, you are seeking collateral benefits to third parties. That would be old-style SRI, old-style socially responsible investing, often called ethical investing or whatever else. We want to call that collateral benefits ESG. You know, if we could start over, we would call that today SRI, right? That if we could start over with a fresh, clean slate, the right label for this would be SRI. That ship has sailed. It's all ESG today, so let's call that collateral benefits ESG. Okay, the other header would be risk-return ESG. By risk-return ESG, I'm talking about using ESG factors, absorbing ESG factors into a multi-factor asset pricing model toward active investment, or using ESG factors to guide your engagement with management in an active shareholder sense. In other words, profit-seeking, using these factors like you would use any other factor toward improved returns or less risk. Right? So this would be use of ESG to seek portfolio efficiency, for more return, less risk. The distinction on some level between risk return and collateral benefits is motive. It's a motive-driven notion. It's why am I using these factors? Because I'm looking for collateral benefits or because I want to improve my own returns. So why this focus on the motive? The focus on the motive because the legality of ESG investing for a fiduciary in large part turns in the first place on the motive, the reason for doing this. That's one reason. The other reason I want to emphasize this difference is I think that there's slippage between the two concepts. I think PRI and others have invoked risk-return ESG and evidence about risk-return ESG at times to begin to justify collateral benefits, and there's confusion between the two. I think there's been a lot of confusion about the position of the DOL, which in truth, if you read each of the DOL positions start to finish, has been unbroken from the beginning, from 94 through today, on its views on collateral benefits versus risk and return. It's just the tone around that has changed. So the motive really matters. So why? Let me explain why legally motive drives this, and then I'll turn economically what we think the evidence shows on this. So legally, why does this matter? The core fiduciary duties are loyalty and care. In trust law and investment concept, care is often called prudence. So loyalty and prudence, the same thing as loyalty and care, loyalty and prudence. The loyalty norm, the duty of loyalty in a trust domain, so that includes ERISA, we're talking trillions of dollars now. The loyalty domain, loyalty in this area is a sole interest or exclusive benefit rule. You must act in the sole interest of your beneficiaries. You must act with the exclusive purpose, the exclusive benefit of your beneficiaries. So what does that mean? What that means is you cannot consider third-party interests. You can't consider what you like. You may not consider third-party benefits. You must solely, only, exclusively look at the interests of the beneficiaries. The public policy that motivates this conception of loyalty is one of prohibition rather than regulation. It's a policy judgment that instead of, after the fact, evaluating, well, was it nevertheless in the best interest of the beneficiaries in spite of considering some other interest, which is a corporate loyalty rule, it's a judgment that we don't even want to play that game. If you consider another interest, you're done. Loyalty violation, right? It's a prophylactic, categorical prohibition on looking at other interests. So that's the duty of loyalty in this area. The duty of prudence, the duty of care, is a relational and objective standard. What would a prudent person similarly situated do? And an investment framework has been elaborated by what we call the prudent investor rule, a rule that, if you look at the text, I think would be quite familiar. It's a rough codification of Markowitz portfolio theory. It more or less says you have to have risk and return objectives reasonably suited to the purpose of the fiduciary account and the circumstances of the beneficiaries, and that this means that you need to diversify unless you have a good reason not to. Right? If you could use the words in the statute, it would say you should pursue portfolio efficiency unless you have a good reason not to. Right? Risk and return reasonably suited to the circumstances of the beneficiaries, and you ought to be diversifying. So along with this prudent investor rule, it's implemented with duties of cost sensitivity. It's okay to spend, it's okay to incur costs, but we want to see an offsetting benefit for it. You need to keep records. We want to see a documented analysis of what you're doing. And periodic review. Right? Just because on day one I've developed a portfolio, an asset allocation with an investment policy statement or whatever, that doesn't mean for all time that this is right. On a reasonable periodic basis, I need to revisit. How often and how frequent? Well, that would depend on the nature of the account and the circumstances. So we have loyalty and prudence. All right, so now let's bring loyalty and prudence back to ESG investing. So let's start with collateral benefits, and then let's talk about risk return. So collateral benefits, ESG, by nature of the way we've defined it, ESG investing, because we're pursuing these collateral benefits. And I should say, we didn't come up with the term collateral. We took that out of the DOL guideline, the DOL statements. The DOL used the term collateral. Collateral benefits ESG, by the way we've defined it, I think quite obviously violates the default version of the duty of loyalty in this area. Right? By definition, considering benefits other than returns for your beneficiary runs afoul of the duty of loyalty. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. Here's a heuristic you can use. You might, as a fiduciary, ask yourself, could I make a distribution for this purpose? Right? Can I make if I'm the trustee of a pension fund, could I make a distribution out of the pension fund to pursue this purpose? Quite obviously not. can only make distributions in cash to the participants. Well, if I can't make a distribution for this purpose, why can I pursue that purpose through the investment function? Right? The investment and distribution are closely tied. In some ways, they're substitutes. So it's a kind of good rule of thumb to look at this. For pensions, I'm talking about now ERISA-governed pensions, the Supreme Court has held that the exclusive benefit rule is financial benefits. The sole benefit exclusive purpose rule is you must be pursuing solely the financial benefits of your participants. So that's now controlling U.S. Supreme Court precedent for ERISA. In a private trust, there's some room for the donor to define within the terms of the trust, and maybe beneficiaries can give consent, but it's a little bit messy, and we can talk about that in Q&A if people want. How about a charitable endowment? So charitable endowment, the endowment is for a charitable purpose. Well, there you can invest, you'd be consistent with the duty of loyalty to make investments consistent with the purpose, but has to be consistent with the purpose. So I think the Sierra Club could avoid fossil fuels on the grounds that that's a substitute for distribution. Sierra Club can make contributions, can spend money on what it thinks is environmental benefits. It can also run the investments that way. I think it's much less clear that Harvard could do that with its endowment because its charitable purpose is education. It's where you see the power of this distribution heuristic and the ferociousness of the duty of loyalty in this sole benefit rule that collateral benefits is not all right. Okay, in the charitable domain, you might hear this sometimes as a program-related investment. Right? Listen to the words, program-related investment. It's an acknowledgement that we are within our purpose. We're consistent with duty of loyalty. But fundamentally, collateral benefits, not all right with the duty of loyalty. I don't think there's a lot of debate about this. This is what the prior generation of legal analysts concluded for divestment from apartheid. We heard a reference to the Sullivan Principles earlier. One of the reasons for the rise of the Sullivan Principles was to avoid the loyalty concerns and so on. So we can talk about that. All right, what's more interesting, I think, is to get into risk-return ESG, the rebranding of socially responsible investment now as what is often called ESG, but I want to call risk-return ESG for clarity. So by definition, it would satisfy the duty of loyalty. I understand that there's an evidentiary difficulty. I can't do a Vulcan mind meld and know what's in your mind and your heart, but actually I can a little bit, and I'll talk about why and how in a few minutes. Let's just accept, for the sake of discussion, that your motive is a profit now. Right? Let's take the PRI at face value. Let's take this at face value. You're pursuing a profit. So that satisfies the loyalty issue. But then we have to satisfy the duty of prudence. We have to satisfy the prudent investor rule and the subsidiary principles of cost sensitivity and record keeping and periodic review. So what do we think about the duty of prudence? I want to suggest that risk-return ESG could satisfy the duty of prudence, but not necessarily so. Not necessarily in every case would it, but it could on a case-by-case basis. So what does this look like? Well, we'd want to see for a fiduciary, a documented analysis of reasonably assessed expected return benefits from using these factors, sufficient to outweigh any attendant diversification costs and any attendant transaction costs. We would also want to see, on a periodic basis, that you refresh that analysis. We want to see on a periodic basis that you refresh that analysis. Why? Well, because that's what the law requires and because it makes sense. There's no reason to think that my investment thesis today that shows a profit will, for all time, show a profit. Notice what this looks like. There are a couple of fun points here. So one is, if today I have a model that shows that tobacco is overpriced and anti-tobacco is underpriced because of misassessment of litigation and regulatory and political risks, well, tomorrow, thanks to BlackRock or others, the numbers might flip the other way. My model might show tomorrow that tobacco is undervalued and anti-tobacco is overvalued. If I'm a risk-return ESG investor, I got to move into tobacco in that moment. Right? Because I'm not about the collateral benefits. I'm about I want to, lower risk, higher returns. And if my model bends on my periodic review, I need to go the other way. Because remember, this is not about collateral benefits on this view. By hypothesis, we're about seeking profit. right? So a second point of this, more generally, is we understand the lack of persistence and findings of abnormal returns and so on. We want to see periodic review. Another reason why I think as a matter of policy this would be sensible is some confusion in the literature about a relationship between ESG factors and firm performance versus a relationship between ESG factors and can I exploit that relationship and firm value for profit. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. There's evidence, there's good theory and evidence for a relationship between E and S factors, for example, and firm value. E and S factors might proxy for management quality, right? They might proxy, there are reasons why there may be a relationship between E and S factors and firm value. Whether or not, however, you can make money on that relationship, you need a story of mispricing of that relationship by markets, or that you, through shareholder engagement, are going to change corporate policies to take advantage of that relationship in a profit way, right? We need both. This is a constant error in the literature, and my favorite example of this is the GAO. So after the 2018 Field Assistance Bulletin that Barbara mentioned, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, put out a report saying it wants the DOL, again, to put out still further guidance. We need further guidance. Why, says the GAO? Because there's all this evidence that ESG factors are material. How does the GAO define materiality? Because there are all these studies that show these factors have a relationship to firm value. So, what's the answer to that? Well, so what? There are many things that have a relationship to firm value. Can I exploit them for profit? Right? Those who think you can't exploit those for profit, they're already priced in, they would go into, say, an index fund. Right? Okay. So we'd want to see a documented analysis of why you think you can exploit these factors for profit and periodic review. So what else follows from this? A couple of points I want to make. One is that, I'm telling you as a descriptive matter of the law, and I'm willing to defend in Q&A as a normative policy matter, that ESG investing can't be mandatory, right? Can't be mandatory. Can't be mandatory for so many reasons, right? One is what does it even mean to say I mandate ESG investing, right? It'd be hard to find a mutual fund today that wouldn't qualify as G because there's going to be proxy voting guidelines. So if you have proxy voting guidelines, you're a G fund at least, right? Suppose you have E and S and G factors. What if you have a firm that's strong on S and weak on E? How do you weight them? There's disagreement about which way G and E points. It's not workable as a mandate. It's also, we have this confusion between relationship to value and profit. But beyond that, to mandate this would be to say that we think we have undervalued factors and they will be undervalued forever. So let me put this another way. When was the last time you thought you identified a market inefficiency? Right, a profit-making market inefficiency. And what you decided to do was to go to the United Nations and ask for a declaration that everybody should trade on your inefficiency. It's just kind of a hard notion to swallow. I'm not saying there's not a relationship between E and S and G factors and firm value. There's a lot of evidence that there is. And I'm not saying that there may not have been mispricing of that or that you can't exploit them in active shareholding. I'm saying it's hard. And as for fiduciary perspective, we want to see a documented analysis updated periodically to justify the costs associated with this. From a fiduciary perspective, you could reasonably conclude, that's too hard. I'm going to go index passive. You could reasonably conclude, I think I've got a thesis here with E, S, and G, and I'm going to document it and periodically review it. But I also think a fiduciary could reasonably conclude, I think tobacco's undervalued. And here's my factor analysis shows it's undervalued and I'm going into sin stocks. Right? Can't be that sin stock thesis is illegal any more than an ESG is illegal. But in all events, the fiduciary's focus has to be risk and return. Right? Once the fiduciary hints at this. Okay, so last two things I want to say. First, an obvious objection here is, but how do I know what was in the fiduciary's heart? Right? Okay, I can't, but I can proxy for it through a robust prudence analysis. This documented analysis of why you think on risk-return grounds ESG is going to produce for you, you're going to have that, and you have to periodically revisit that. And if you have that and you periodically revisit this, I understand we can torture our regression models and we can play games. But at some point, whatever your motive is, if you're documenting that you're seeking profit and you're updating that, you're seeking profit. And when your analysis, your model shows that ESG factors are overvalued, you got to move away from them. And if you don't, I've got you, right? You see what I'm getting? You could, what do you call a bad person who only does good things? A good person. Right? I mean, on some level, I don't really need to know exactly what's in your heart. I need to see the rigorous fiduciary prudence analysis, and I think that's a backdoor check on loyalty. That's one thing I want to say. Okay, here's the last point, and I have to do this as the academic in the room. There is a kind of peculiar tension between the suggestion of the PRI that we can both make money and do good at the same time. And this is this is not my point. This has kind of been made for decades. So I just want to be clear on what the debate is about this. To the extent that your risk return ESG model, right, you're using risk return ESG, you think these factors are mispriced, or that I can exploit them in active shareholding. And here, this explains Vanguard and BlackRock. You're passive investing, but you're actively shareholding through engagement through management. That I'm going to make money on this. What you're suggesting is that these are factors that will improve returns or lower risk in your investments. Okay, if, however, your idea is that I'm going to use these factors, right? I'm going to use these factors, particularly in a stock picking sense, to change behavior of companies. If your lever for changing the behavior of companies is to increase their cost of capital, right? If your lever is to increase the cost of capital, another way to say increase the cost of capital is you're sacrificing return. Don't they mean the same thing? If you're increasing the cost of capital of bad actors, you're sacrificing return, right? That's the sin stock theory. Now, I understand if you're going to say it's an active shareholding, I'm not increasing the cost of capital. I'm exercising my shareholder control rights to change corporate policies. That's a different story. But it's a stock picking sense. There's this fundamental tension between collateral benefit and risk return that's not really, it's a straightforward sort of point. I'm not the first. Folks have made this. All right, so I want to wrap this up so we have time for Q&A. I'd love to talk about these things. So here's a kind of, if you take away anything from the discussion, right, I think it'd be 2 points I want to suggest. One is that this umbrella term ESG is really obfuscates more than it clarifies, and I think it really helps to call it collateral benefits risk return. Now, obviously, those are our labels that Max and I came up with, and it would be a nice win for us to get the industry to go there. But I think we've met with the DOL, they like it. I mean, it's really intuitive, this idea, risk return ESG, collateral benefits ESG. It lines up with fiduciary. I think it would bring clarity. That's one thing. And the second is, I don't think any responsible legal analyst of the fiduciary principles applicable here could conclude that ESG investing categorically is prohibited. That's not right. I think that it's collateral benefits ESG is a real problem for a fiduciary. Risk return, that's different. That's profits, but that's not special to ESG. That's just saying I can pursue profit wherever I see a money-making opportunity. As long as I've reasonably analyzed it, I can go for it, and as long as I keep revisiting it. So you see what I'm doing here? I'm just equating ESG with sin stocks or passive or whatever else. Right? So here's my punchline of this. In my world, in fiduciary land, we have this thing called the restatement of trust and so on, that's produced by the American Law Institute. It's not like if you go look in these legal sources, you look in ERISA, you look in the restatement, you look in Scott on Trusts, that you'll see, if you make an investment, the following rules apply. Provided, however, if it's an ESG investment, there are all these different rules. It's not true. If you are a fiduciary and you're making an investment, the following rules apply, full stop. ESG, passive, other forms of active, they're all the same, can be absorbed into this framework. And I think that works once we understand the difference between collateral benefits ESG and risk return ESG. And that helps us avoid mistakes like there's a relationship to firm value being a very different question from can I exploit that relationship with firm value for profit. Okay, I'll stop so we can get on and Bob can go and then we can get into Q&A.
Sounds like a plan, Rob.
Yeah.
Well, let me try to comment on what's been said and try to be short enough that we can have Q&A. So I agree that the distinction between risk-return ESG and collateral benefits ESG is a useful distinction, and it's one that brings some clarity. But I think the analogy to making a distribution goes down the wrong path, because what ESG is about is the consideration of a variety of factors over a variety of time frames. And so all you have to show if you are doing ESG is that these factors are relevant to your decision, and they could be relevant over a variety of different time frames. So it's different. Making a distribution is like making a final decision. And I think that is misunderstanding what a lot of people are doing in ESG, which is considering a lot of factors. And the reason I think that is because I've been involved with a lot of asset managers who have chosen to adopt the UN standards. And the reason they did it is because they thought they wouldn't change very much, because good asset managers consider all of these factors. That's very different than saying I'm going to make my decision, my final decision, on the basis of a particular factor within a particular time frame. And that leads me to this whole question of motive. Is I think it's a good academic position to say it depends on your motive, but it's really hard to tell motive. And you can say we're going to look at the work papers, et cetera, so that will lead to a lot of facade work papers in which people will go through the process. But in the end, the work papers are going to show it was relevant to consider all these ESG factors, not whether they made the decision based on that. And so that's different. Second point is, I think you're correct in pointing out that ERISA, given the Supreme Court's decision, is where Chief Justice Breyer italicized financial, has a stricter rule on ESG than other legal frameworks. But I think you would be the first to agree that a creative use of risk and return and can fit a lot of these factors into long-term financial analysis. And it has a lot to do with the framework of long-term, and I'll talk about why I think long-term is often a fudge that's not a particularly useful fudge, but it's there all the time. By contrast, if you have a mutual fund that's a green fund, that's what you've held out to investors, so you ought to go that way. Public funds depends on exactly the state and whether they've copied ERISA and how they're interpreting that. Charities, endowments, many of them have purposes. I was involved as a trustee of a healthcare foundation which decided not to invest in tobacco. That was, in my view, clearly consistent with what they viewed as the purpose. So I just point out that ERISA is the toughest standard here, but there are a lot of other standards that are applicable. Third of all, I think it's important to distinguish between the E, S, and G, and I think both speakers started to do that. And G, as I think several people have said, is governance, and governance is always relevant. Again, what's the meaning of it? Well, we can debate whether or not, for instance, an independent chair versus the CEO chair is going to make a difference in terms of how the company, whether the company is going to be operated better or not. The evidence is mixed, probably depends a lot on the company. So I think we have to look at governance factors. Good analysts look at governance factors always and have done, and that's nothing special. E I think is probably now becoming more important for certain sorts of companies. Obviously, a company in the energy business or the oil business, E is very relevant. It's very relevant in terms of risk analysis. And we now have efforts led by Michael Bloomberg to have a different financial or a supplementary financial reporting standards based on E, and that will probably lead to more delineation of the risk involved as well as the potential benefits. I think S is where the issues really get joined for collateral benefits. And if someone really says, I'm just doing this for S, like the healthcare fund is doing it for healthcare foundation for taking out tobacco, well, that's an explicit statement, but actually it's relatively rare that people make that sort of statement. Fourth is to talk about profits and purpose, which is, I think, one of the ways BlackRock puts it. Yes, they can be consistent, but they can also be in conflict for obvious reasons, that if you decide to pay your employees more, that can help you get a better workforce, or it can just mean you're paying your employees more and you're not getting enough retention value. You can lower your prices to customers and hope that you'll get more customers, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. I think we have a number of, here's a concrete example, a company like Dick's Sporting Goods decided to not sell guns after a number of these terrible incidences. And the question is, did they do it because they thought it was good public policy, or they did it because they thought that would attract customers to come to their store to buy other goods? To me, if you're taking the view that this pursuit of social purpose is going to produce profits, then I'd like to see companies and investment managers delineate what time frame they're using. The word long-term is used very blithely to include everything from 3 years to 10 years to 20 years. And so I don't know what it means when people say this can be reconciled in the long term, because as Keynes said, in the long term, we're all dead. So hopefully we mean a shorter period than that. And my personal view is, in the investment world, anything beyond 3 years starts to get pretty dicey. About beyond 5 years, I don't know any client that holds on for above 5 years if the performance isn't good. So I'd like to see a definition of long term, and I'd like to see some metrics, something that would say, okay, if we go this way, what should we expect? To give another, just to go back to this example, if we say we're not selling guns because we're going to attract customers who are going to give us a lot of other business, well, then let's measure whatever it is that we think we're going to do and have some metrics, and then we'll know whether or not we achieve that. So I think this is a great discussion. I think that to go back to what are my key points, one is we're not talking about using ESG to make the final definitive decision. We're talking about whether these factors can be considered. And that's a very different approach, and I agree totally. That means you can consider ESG or you cannot consider ESG. It gives you a lot of room to maneuver, and we pretty much allow investment managers to consider lots of factors, and we don't police that very much, and I'm not sure why we should police ESG a lot more by requiring lots of paperwork and lots of procedures. I mean, I'm thinking when I ran Fidelity, if we asked every analyst to write down all the factors that they made them buy or sell certain stocks, we'd have a lot of excess paperwork, and it wouldn't be a particularly good use of their time. We want them to consider everything and how they put it together, how it changes, how a time frame. We sort of leave it up to them. Second of all, I think it's important to realize that Rob has done some really excellent work on ERISA and certain trust standards, and I think they are stricter than the standards that we apply to mutual funds and public funds, charities, endowments. And so I think we ought to realize, and I'm sure Rob does because he's a law professor at Harvard, so he must understand all these nuances because he teaches at the law school, as we say in Boston. Third of all,
We were doing so well.
Third of all, I think we ought to stop saying ESG. We ought to realize that G is built into the territory, and then we can discuss E and G. But there's not, I mean, everyone agrees that G is relevant. The question is exactly how it's relevant. Well, I teach a course on corporate governance. I can tell you we're not sure. Probably a good statement is good governance is really important when the company's not doing so well. And pick a good CEO, and that's the most important thing you can do for governance. And lastly is if we're going to take the view, whether it's in the company context or investment context, that, good purpose and profits, it's all, we can do both. With all due respect to Larry Fink, it's a worthwhile goal, and sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. And it also, whether it's true or not, may vary a lot depending on what time frame you use. And Larry was very smart to include, I'm sure Barbara included for him, the long term in his letter. So then, of course, we can reconcile these over the long term if we only understood what exactly was the long term and what we meant by that. So maybe a better thing is to say if we're gonna say that profit and social purpose and ESG and investment returns, they're all going to work out and everybody wins. Let's have a delineation by whatever the entity is as to what time frame we should use and what metrics they think we should look at to see whether in fact we're achieving this purpose. I'm going to stop there so we can have time for discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob. Let's hear from you now. Questions for our excellent panel. Let's go in the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Bob Hughes. I thought your comments, Robert, were very interesting.
Which we have several Roberts here. So
It's three Roberts.
I'm going to call myself Bob. He's going to call himself Rob.
It's three Roberts and a Barbara.
Okay.
Bob.
For a time with some of the research that I'm doing, in particular the motivation and the project focus of the organization within the ESG context that I had. So it's one question focusing on public plans. Do you think a public pension can be on a more solid legal footing by drafting or modifying investment policy, the investment philosophy statements, essentially establishing values to provide cover for ESG investment, and in doing so, the employee and later beneficiary effectively opts in to these values by choosing to work there versus another firm?
Yeah. So, no, it's a fun question. So let me just say, if I put my lawyer hat on a moment, it's always frightening when the client says, "So here's how we're going to cover." That's a red flag. Don't put that one in an email. So the question really gets the question is one of can we bring in some collateral benefit? I think what I'm hearing, what you're getting at is, can we bring in collateral benefit in a public pension by having this in our statement of investment policy statement or a statement of the plan, and yeah.
Absolutely, but it's also a little bit more subtle. Can a public pension establish a value?
Yeah.
Beyond just
beyond the financial benefits for the okay. So if you're a private pension subject to ERISA, that's pretty settled by the Supreme Court decision that exclusive benefit for financial benefits the end. And for public pension, you're not subject to ERISA. You're subject to whatever kind of fiduciary law in your state where you came from. So if you're in California, you've got a sole benefit rule. It's in the California Constitution. Right? It's literally constitutional law in California to have this sole benefit rule. And there's been some fun news about CalPERS and this lately and so on. So the first point would be, where are you located? If you're located in a jurisdiction that's got a sole benefit, exclusive benefit rule, I wouldn't give you a clean opinion on this, because you'd need to anticipate that your state courts are going to follow what the Supreme Court did with ERISA. If you don't, if you have a looser rule, then possibly, but, and this is a kind of a big question in ERISA and pensions. Let me make this broader. So today we're in a defined contribution world, not defined benefit, and so people get a menu of mutual funds into which they can invest. Building that menu is a fiduciary act. So you need to, and people are being sued today constantly for their menu construction. Ironically, they're being sued that their menu has too many active funds, which of course ESG often would be. Can I put into my menu a collateral benefits ESG fund, on the theory that I've got workers who want that kind of investment strategy? I think if you're in ERISA, no. It's a congressional, it's a statute that has a paternalistic policy that says do whatever you want with your money when it's in your pocket when you've retired. But until then, you're in this fiduciary solution. So in answer to your question, I would be reluctant and hesitant unless I felt really good about much weaker loyalty fiduciary rules in my jurisdiction. I think you're going to be hard-pressed to prevail on a court. Well, but the employee had all this choice where to work and chose me, and you know that is actually not an E or an S type argument, right? You kind of see that going the other way. So I would that would give me some heartburn.
Can I just add that I think that it all depends on how you construct your investment policy. If you say your policy is to consider these factors, ESG factors, with respect to risk and return over the relevant time frame, you'll have enough room to maneuver to get where you want within certain parameters. So I think, again, you're back to the question is, what exactly are you proposing here? Are you proposing to make the final investment decision on ESG, or to consider these factors over the relevant time frame? If you stick with the second formulation, I think you'll be okay in the sort of public fund area that you're talking about.
So if I could just answer from an investment perspective, I'm not an attorney, and I don't teach at the law school or the business school or any of those. But, you know, I mentioned the MSCI series, and they have two different series of indices. And as the time series grows, I think it'll actually make a very interesting set of data to do more research on, because both of these are broad portfolios, lots of companies, lots of sectors that take ESG data into account in different ways. We actually believe that the Focus series will, and certainly the back testing, but you know how back tests can be, that the back testing shows that you can have purpose and profit, you can have a better ESG characteristic portfolio, and very good long-term returns. So if that plays out, and it suggests that companies that are better managed, I said G is number one of the G, E, and S. In fact, I wish it was called GES, not ESG. If that plays out over time with this data, I think it'll be very compelling to people that this is something that they want to look at as an investment factor.
Let's move on. Yes, ma'am.
One area that I'm going to raise is the perspective of colleges and universities, and one group perhaps that we haven't talked about is Phil, given how influential he's been to get this dynamic, particularly on the E issue around college campuses. And I'm sure some of you also have been on some college boards where this has been very debated, and particularly hearing Rob's comments. Colleges have gone down the path in many instances of creating ESG as a factor. They've addressed it in many different ways. I wonder if at some point we're going to get a backlash, because the arguments that occurred in most places and the implementations have not been created in these rigid buckets. The debate starts from the trustees. Is this within our fiduciary responsibility and they managed to somehow back off and pedal and create a space for this initiative to start. And I just wonder whether we've been in an affluent, successful period of time, and it's been accepted, and whether we might go through a backlash period when this standard starts to get held in a different way in a college setting.
Well, so let me say something about endowment investing. So first is charities can be organized as trusts, but they can also be organized as corporations. Right? Harvard is a corporation, not a trust. And the duty of loyalty in corporate law is not as ferocious as in trust law. It's not a sole interest rule, it's a best interests test. So the first thing to say is that the legal test is a little bit weaker if you're organized in that form. The second is I suggested if it's mission-related investing, if Sierra Club doesn't have fossil fuel, that's where we're talking about the distribution heuristic. In other words, I wasn't using distribution heuristic in risk return. I said as collateral benefit. It's not a collateral benefit if the benefit's within your purpose. Then it's not collateral anymore. It's okay. But as for university and say and environmental and divestment specifically, let me say something practically and then a kind of observation from universities. So practically, whereas in a pension or a trust, you have beneficiaries or participants who have an economic interest and legal standing to sue you after there's a decline for your bad portfolio management. Generally speaking, the only party with standing to police charitable endowments is the state AG, the aspiring governor. It's not, in terms of what's my litigation risk, I think if I'm the Harvard committee deciding what goes in our 403B, 401k, that's a much greater litigation risk than the Attorney General of Massachusetts suing for the portfolio. So I think you may have more space legally based on your entity. Practically, there's going to be more space because the aspiring governor, unless it's a gubernatorial election coming up and you're looking bad in the media, it's unclear. You want to get involved. But then more broadly, I just want to give one data point observationally. I think it would be fun if you go back later and look up the Stanford trustees' statement on the Stanford divestment from fossil fuels, right? I'm talking Stanford, Leland Stanford Junior University. It's a junior university, but whatever. If you look at their statement carefully, it's a brilliant lawyering, right? What the statement actually says is, we formed this committee to look at divestment, and we agree that ethically there could be things we can't invest in. And we figured out in fossil fuels there is something that ethically we can't have. It's sands oil. We can't be involved in sands oil. It happens to be, however, that we didn't have any sands oil in the portfolio, so there's nothing to divest. We have a lot of fossil fuels, but not sands oil. As for all the rest of the fossil fuels, of course we're using ESG factors to assess long-term risk and how that'll affect the portfolio, right? So I read this as, we embrace collateral benefits ESG in theory, but we don't have to reach the question because we don't actually have any of it. What we're actually doing is risk return, and then Stanford gets celebrated for divesting from fossil fuel, right? So, now I don't know what was actually said in the room and so on. And this to me feels a lot like total divestment versus Sullivan Principles in the apartheid era and the like. But, so it's kind of three levels, right? You have a different standard. You have a weak plaintiff who doesn't really care unless he's going to get you elected governor or something. And then, there's to what extent is it within the purpose?
Yes, ma'am.
So I have Elizabeth Hess from Brown Advisory. I have a quick question about the possible convergence between kind of the risk reward view of ESG and collateral benefits. Kind of through a really recent example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the PG&E situation, with California utilities. So, for example, it was reported in Bloomberg that really the stock was so widely underheld by ESG sustainable-oriented funds because they acknowledged the many risks the management had disclosed about the possibility of natural disaster or wildfire. So, in a case where there is perhaps a positive externality involved in avoiding an investment like that, but also there's the view of considering it from a risk-reward perspective, can you just speak to an example something like that, where perhaps an ESG view of the complex realities of avoiding that disaster overlapped with financial return?
Well, I think it's clearly they had an environmental risk, and so it's clearly legitimate for a manager to think of their environmental risk and a larger risk, and not hold the stock. But what Rob said is relevant, and it has to do with pricing. So that all depends on, so there's a risk, but the question is whether the return is worth the risk. So now the stock has gone from whatever it was to almost nothing. And so now it's a different question, right? It's a different question because of the pricing. So if you just view it as a risk return issue, and it's not a collateral benefits issue, so now the same risk are there, but the price has already come down by 95%. So it's a different question. So that's where I think you would come out if you looked at it on a risk return basis.
Sir in the back, you'll be our last question.
Paul Atkins, Philanthropic Confusion, Washington. I just had a question regarding the normative aspects of some of the ESG investing that's going on. And I read Larry's new letter here very quickly a few minutes ago. So it sounds like you all are pursuing sort of the same course. So congratulations on the written piece. But as far as the normative aspects, Jay Clayton, Mr. First, and also Elliot Glass have talked about the need perhaps for more disclosure around how investment managers are using these particular factors in decision making, especially on the normative side, and what the goals are, given Professor Sitkoff's points. Do you all believe that there should be enhanced disclosure around this?
Right. So different people have different ideas of what they want disclosed. I do think there needs to be two things. One is any product that we're offering should have what I call truth in advertising. And whether that's an ESG, an ETF product, that's a mutual fund product, that's whatever kind of product, it should be very clear in the disclosure what is an investor getting or not getting. And then it becomes an asset owner decision, do I want that or not? The second thing is, and we did release the updated website, we've had lots of disclosure on our web, but I would say I took this area over a year ago, and I was finding it hard to find the information I was looking for. So I said to my team, now, if I'm the inside person and I need to use the, dial a friend method of finding what I want, that doesn't bode well for people externally finding what they're interested in. So we have actually revamped the entire website. We've refreshed all of the documents. So we have engagement priorities, we have voting guidelines. And voting guidelines, by the way, are very much jurisdiction specific because there are different rules in different countries that we have to acknowledge. So everything from Canada to Latin America to Japan to China, I mean, you can't even imagine this project. We also post once a year our actual voting data. Now, again, I said in my prepared remarks, I caution using voting data as the sole way of judging what someone is or isn't doing, because it's a lot more complicated than that. It's the easiest, and I'll say there's a little bit of a laziness factor of saying, well, let me just add up these votes, and how often did you vote against management has now become a fashionable thing. I would say voting against management is a investment stewardship failure. That means you weren't able to make any progress in persuading people of something you thought was important. Either they thought it wasn't important, and so there's a gap, or something's gone wrong here. But many, many shareholder proposals we vote against. We think they're either too prescriptive or they're way premature in what they're asking a company to do. we had in the task force climate disclosure, we started engaging with companies. Many of the companies, even in the sector, had yet to even read the standards. So how could you expect them immediately to be reporting? And it's a big fat document. So I think some of these things, patience really is a virtue. Patience is required. What's the exact time frame? $1 million question, hard to say. But I do think we have to give companies time. And I'll use as an example, when I started my career, the most common thing was a boardroom was, well, certainly all white men, and they all sat on each other's boards, right? Every sitting CEO was on multiple boards, and sometimes the same CEO was on their board, and so on. Today, you don't see that. I mean, a board will only allow their CEO to sit on maybe one outside board. And many boards don't allow their CEO to sit on any outside boards. An independent director used to be common. They were on, 5 and 6 and 7 boards. Today, the time required to be a good board member and really knowledgeable at the company, knowing what's going on, putting in the time and effort intellectually, etc. We would vote against somebody, and we'd call that overboarding. So some of these things, and this is, it can be glacial change, but if you do a 10-year snapshot and the next 10-year snapshot, you see that progress. That doesn't satisfy a lot of people who want results now. Yesterday's fake letter. But realistically, this is a very long game, and I think we have to give companies time, never mind the asset managers, we have to give the companies time to address things. And we have to look at both the risk and the opportunity. There are environmental things that one company, I'll give a cute example. I went to a conference and somebody was handing out, get at these conferences, all sorts of silly things. So there was one thing, and it was these little animals. And they were very colorful. Brought some home for my kids. But what was interesting about the animals is they were flip-flops that had washed up on the beaches in some distant country, Southeast Asia, and they had taken those flip-flops and they had turned them into a thing that they could sell. So here's clearly something that is environmentally bad being taken and turned into something that they could sell for a profit and then use that money to clean up their own environment. So it was just sort of an interesting idea at a very simple level of how you could take an environmental issue and turn it into a positive and an opportunity. So I'll leave you with that.
Well, thank you. Before we go, a couple of housekeeping items. While I'm talking, if you would fill out your comment cards so we can let the speakers know how they've done. And I want to thank you for not leaving the room. As you know, we've got some new faces here, and I just want to say we only leave the room after the comment cards. But I do want to acknowledge the patron saint of compounding. Let's talk about long-term investing. 15 years ago, Jack Bogle sat in this room, and he was brave enough to come to the temple of 2 and 20. And he warned us about the corrosive nature of fees on the portfolio. So I just want to recognize Jack Bogle. And with that, I do want to thank someone who doesn't want to be thanked, Brian Furtado and Kurt Schacht for putting this session together. It was a long time coming. We've ignored the advice of people saying we've got to do this session. We finally did it, and it was very much worthwhile. So thank you very much, Kurt. And I got a really interesting announcement. We're going to eliminate member dues. You don't have to pay dues anymore. So we're going to a listener-supported model. In other words, if you like, we're performing without a net, as John put it. Exactly. So no more dues, but it's all voluntary contributions, much like every other eleemosynary institution here in town. So you'll be getting something in the mail on that, a little bit more. But what does that mean? So there'll still be members of the roundtable, but a couple of underlying conditions. We've been off the record for 25 years. Poor Paul was we said we were off the record, but somebody went out and talked to a reporter when Paul Atkins spoke here about 10 years ago. But what does that mean? We've had a philosophical debate, and it's been, with John Griswold, we have an educational mission and a duty to people to share what we know. And Ryan Dartnell says, we've got a good thing going, let's keep it to ourselves. And so, but, we've managed that balance. And as John said, why didn't you tell the world? But now, going forward, we will be on the record. So, what is said in this room has a possibility of going out and being spoken about in the press. So, fasten your seatbelts. But with that, we've added a third thing to our mission. I think it's apropos of what's being said today, and that's we're going to be focusing on long-term investing and the power of compounding. So let's look at it with that lens, and it's not 3; it's more like 20 to 30 years. And so, with that, we're adding that to our mission. So, in addition to looking for inefficient pricing, we will be looking at, how it affects compounding. And with that is persistence. So with that, I want to thank Rob, Bob, and Barb, and Bob for putting together a spectacular panel. So thank you very, very much.